Hey, everybody. I'm Santi Ruiz. I'm at the Institute for Progress. We work on tech and innovation policy. I also write a newsletter, an interview series called Statecraft, where we interview folks like Trae Stevens, here to my left. He's a general partner at Founders Fund, co-founder of Anduril. You guys know him. Same with Michael Kratsios, served as Chief Technology Officer of the US in the Trump White House, also served as Acting Undersecretary of Defense. These days, he's Managing Director of Scale AI. We're going to talk about the arsenal of democracy. And I think there's likely some consensus here in the room and on this panel about a couple basic instincts. I'm going to try and avoid asking questions like, is China a pacing threat? Is manufacturing in America good? We're going to try and pre-clear that stuff and get right into the good stuff. Let me start with you, Trae. Innovation spend at the DoD is something of a disaster. What specifically is going wrong?
I think that the government, largely speaking, has good intentions. I think they do want to invest in new capabilities. I think they do believe that they don't have access to the technologies that they want to have access to through the traditional defense industrial base. The problem is that they also very deeply believe that they don't want to pick winners. And the result of that is that the money gets split up into thousands of tiny little pots, none of which have really any hope of transitioning into production. And so it ends up being more like a university grad school research program rather than a manufacture for scale process.
When you say they don't want to pick winners, I feel like a lot of people in this room think, okay, Northrop Grumman, like there's plenty of, what do you mean they don't pick winners? What does that mean in practice?
Yeah, I mean they don't pick winners from commercial industry. The majority of procurement dollars go to what is generally referred to as the Big Five: Northrop, Lockheed, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Boeing. And for all intents and purposes, you should think of those five companies as subsidiaries of the United States government. They're basically government agencies. They're just private sector rather than public sector. But they're directly tethered to GDP growth. So, they all grow low single-digit percentages per year. They all have roughly the same margin profile between 7 and 12% that's on cost-plus contracts. So they're paid for the labor that they do with enough margin to cover operating costs. And the government very carefully meters out contracts so that they all continue to grow at roughly the same rate. And as we all know, like a centrally planned economy is not the most efficient way to do this. And there's very little appetite, or has really over the last 30 years, there's been very little appetite to shake out of that system.
Michael, what do most people get wrong about the defense industrial base? You've spent time inside DoD and in the White House. What's a common misperception here?
I think, unfortunately, for a lot of folks that have been part of this new wave of defense tech over the last 2 or 3 years, I think they get wrong that there's a chance that there's going to be a lot of winners out of there. Unfortunately, I think the reality on the ground and at the Pentagon is there have been long established programs that were created many years ago to support small businesses in the United States. Those have been sort of like rebranded and sort of recreated and for all the different services, and all these dollars are going out to a whole lot of companies around the U.S. that I think at their core are on a very important mission and oftentimes have founders that are trying to do really amazing things. But as Trae mentioned, the reality is that at the end of the day, the conversion of those into real substantial material contracts is still very low. And I think, I'm not a venture capitalist. I mean, more the question for Trae. I'm curious how you think of sort of this newfound infatuation with funding defense tech companies over the last 3 years, and I'm always a little bit curious, where all these investors think these returns are going to come from.
Trae, where do these investors think the returns are going to come from?
Well, there are positives and negatives. On the positive side, I think there's a good cultural shift that's happening where it's becoming more acceptable for the most talented people to work on defense problems. That was certainly not the case when me, Palmer, Matt, and Brian started Anduril in 2017. And so I think that's good. I think it's good that the Department of Defense is starting to kind of get ahead of steam around bridge transition funding and, giving a more budget, more authority to the Defense Innovation Unit, kind of launching Army Futures Command and whatever that will eventually mean. And so there's a positive angle to that. The negative angle is that, the way that the tech industry works is on a power law curve, not a normal, Gaussian distribution of returns. So Founders Fund has been around for 20 years. In November, it'll be 20 years. And we've invested in literally thousands of companies. And 12 of those thousands of companies have returned over 95% of all returns to our investors. And so this is what that term power law means. And if you think about the big winners in the fund, we were the Series A lead in Facebook. We were the largest institutional investor in SpaceX, in Palantir, in Airbnb, in Stripe. In each of these industries, they were the winner. Like if you were a space tech investor and you didn't invest in SpaceX, you probably lost money. If you were a social media investor and you didn't invest in Facebook, you probably lost money. If you're a crypto investor and you didn't invest in Coinbase, you probably lost money. If every single one of these industries has this sort of power law dynamic to it. And to Michael's point, I think the challenge is that a lot of people look at the defense tech industry and they're like, well, Anduril made it work. I guess that means that there's a market space now that I can run into. And that's great. As I said, I'm glad these companies are doing it. But what if it was just Anduril? What if that's the only company? Well, people are going to lose a lot of money. And we might end up going right back into this cycle where there's just kind of lackluster returns. The investors run away. It's going to take another 20 years to kind of reset and get people excited about the market again. So these moments of hype and boom are not necessarily universally positive.
I don't want to make us spend the whole 40 minutes on defense procurement, but I do want just a little bit more from you, Trae. What would it look like for the government to be picking winners consciously, to be shifting from its existing procurement model?
Well, I mean, this past April, there was an award of a contract called CCA, the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, which is essentially an autonomous fighter plane. And the 5 finalists for that contract were Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Atomics, and Anduril. And in an old system, it would have been very obvious. They would give the contract to Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. That's what should have happened. But the Air Force really wanted to do things differently, and they decided to give the contract to General Atomics and Anduril, eliminating Lockheed, Northrop, and Boeing, which is crazy if you think about it. So I think there are stories, there's momentum in the direction of being able to kind of empower people to take risks that they might not otherwise have been interested in taking. But we need to see more of that. And I think the most important thing, and this goes back again to what Michael said, is that there's a difference between a prototype or a pilot, some sort of research and development program, and a major weapons development program. These are generally called DoD 5000 series contracts. And those are the ones that they always go to the primes. That's just kind of how it works. I think if this were working correctly over the next 10 years, maybe we'd see half of those 5000 series programs go to tech entrants rather than traditional industry entrants. I think that's really what we're building the entire company at Anduril around, is being competitive to go out and win those really big contracts and not worrying about can we do a prototype that gets people excited that we can make videos of.
Michael, you've spent a lot of time both on the defense industrial base and on other ways that U.S. policy can support emerging tech in the national interest. Talk a little bit about that.
I think one way to kind of think about it is we as a country are trying to position ourselves to kind of maintain our edge and make sure that we're in a position to continue to deter a Chinese threat. I think we have to. What I always think about, and when it goes beyond just the tools and equipment that the DoD has, which are critical for the U.S. to focus on. And I think a lot of the emphasis can sometimes go on strictly kind of activities that the DoD can do in order to try to deter what China is going to do. And I think a lot of the coordination efforts that are happening today, and I think are equally important. And probably if you're a believer that for foreseeable future, I think everyone's highly incentivized to not enter into a kinetic war with China, what does it mean to have to sort of be able to counter their economic warfare? And I think this goes back to a lot of the efforts that the U.S. does today on things like export controls on chips. And those are kind of more protect actions, which the U.S. has to get right. We can get into a lot of details on those. But the other ones, which I think are equally important, are around sort of the promote activities. And that is something where how can we as the United States export our technologies to countries around the world and make sure that we as America are sort of creating the standards for the technologies most important for the future. And when I was in government, we fought sort of these massive sort of like Huawei wars, if you will. Like we were in this like really sort of unfortunate position where, some of our strongest allies, had this sort of nefarious technology baked into their infrastructure, and we were trying to find ways, literally begging them to sort of like rip it out. And I think we have sort of an opportunity with sort of the new emerging techs around artificial intelligence to not make that mistake again. And what I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on is how do we make sure that the standard for AI across the world is American? And I think that is sort of as equally important in many ways as a lot of the deterrence around building our defense base.
What are some of the tactical lessons from that Huawei experience? You have to go to your allies and, like you said, beg. Like, what does that actually look like, and what works and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think in that particular situation, the challenge that we faced was that there was no U.S. alternative, and it was sort of this oftentimes embarrassing conversation where we would lay out a very detailed sort of intelligence report on why it was so bad, and it was and then they would say, okay, well, what do you want us to do about it? And we would say, like you have to go buy some Nokia or Ericsson, and maybe we can help you. And I think the challenge, and I think that what you kind of hear oftentimes is the Chinese can come to a lot of these countries with sort of a briefcase of money, and the U.S. comes with like a lecture, and that typically is sort of this like running joke around how the U.S. conducts a lot of its foreign policy influence. And I think why we're kind of in this lucky position with this current wave of technology is that the U.S. is the home for the best and highest end semiconductors. It is the home for the most state-of-the-art, AI models. So we have a homegrown stack which we can export to countries that are interested in artificial intelligence. And I think it's incumbent on us to sort of like use the sort of development resources that we have as a government, whether it be at places like DFC or XM or even USAID. These are pockets of money that are statutorily designed to attempt to sort of support U.S. exports and U.S. sort of development abroad. And I think those are places that we need to really, really focus on.
For those of us who are relative neophytes to how the XM Bank works, will you just give like 2 more minutes on how you use those big pots of money to work on this?
You mean the International Bank of Boeing? 80% of XM dollars go to Boeing Corporation. Thank you, U.S. taxpayer.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think the challenge with these institutions is that for the entirety of their existence, they focus very much on the export of physical hardware. So probably the most famous examples are the Boeing ones, where there's a country that has a national airline that wants to, potentially get some new planes, and they're essentially subsidized in some sense by the U.S. government for them to buy Boeing planes or other American planes. And I think
but mostly Boeing.
But I think what I think really needs to be looked at very closely is, can these institutions be used to help export other things that aren't necessarily an aircraft or a wind turbine or an oil pipeline? And I think like the most valuable thing that the U.S. has now that we can export is software, and that is something that I think needs to be looked at very closely by these institutions.
Trae, similar question to you. Besides DoD getting its house in order, what else does industry need to see, or what else does industry, what are wants, not needs, maybe, but to be rebuilding parts of the defense industrial base, leave aside the procurement model?
Well, I think manufacturing is a huge part of this. One of the core lessons that we've learned from the war in Ukraine is that if we ever were to enter into a protracted conflict with another great power, we would run out of munitions in 8 days. not 8 years or 8 months, 8 days. And so, if you look at what we sent over to Ukraine in the early days of the conflict, things like Patriot missiles, Stingers, Javelins, these are Cold War era technology that were manufactured, and that we literally shut down the assembly line. And when we wanted to go back and resupply that, Raytheon had to go and get some of their engineers to come out of retirement to rebuild the manufacturing lines. This is kind of like a gutting that's happened over the last 30 years, really, with the defense industry, where we basically just ceded global leadership in manufacturing to China. And I think the politicians of the 90s, like Clinton era politics, had this belief that globalization was going to be good, and there were certainly some ways in which it was good. It helped industrialize other countries. It was supposed to be good for the American middle class, but obviously we can see what kind of happened in much of the country as a lot of those jobs were offshored. And really what we lost more than anything else was skilled labor. So I started a consumer hardware company 3 years ago, just kind of on the side, not Anduril related. And one of the things that we noticed really quickly is that it wasn't just that Chinese labor was cheaper and that these components were like subsidized and made much easier to get from China. It was that literally you could not get them anywhere else. There was no alternative. Like, you couldn't pay more to get it made in the United States. The labor force didn't exist to make it in the United States, regardless of how much you were willing to pay. And so I think we're in this place now with defense manufacturing, where we're being asked to do things at scale. We're being asked to do things with high degrees of precision. And meanwhile, Boeing airplanes have doors falling off mid-flight, and our astronauts are stranded in space for 9 months because they messed up, one of the critical systems. It's kind of like the idiocracy version of manufacturing in 2024, and we don't talk about this enough. Like, we actually have to fix this from the ground up.
What does that look like? You have to go from 0 to 1 on certain kinds of skilled labor. You have a kind of a cold start on being able to manufacture something we haven't manufactured in 40 years or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of components to this. I think this is a great place for the tech community to contribute. There are several really interesting companies that are working in advanced manufacturing. Companies like Hadrian that are doing kind of bringing autonomy to manufacturing. There's a company called Layup Parts that we invested in at Founders Fund that's doing carbon fiber prototyping, which is really important for aerospace. There's a company called Dirac that's doing the automation of assembly instructions. So you pass it a CAD file and then it generates the assembly instructions. So there are things that you can do that smooth the path to getting back on the horse with manufacturing. But our approach to this at Anduril, aside from just integrating and partnering with those companies, which we've done, is we need to build a gigafactory. If you go back and you look at before Tesla had set up the gigafactory, GM was talking about its manufacturing of electric vehicles, and they had these kind of crazy low estimates to how many they would be able to produce. And Elon came in and he said, we're going to make, I think it was 500,000 was the first number that he threw out. And everyone's like, oh, you're crazy. That's never going to happen. It's not possible. The supply chain doesn't exist. And he was like, all right, we're going to build a battery factory, and then we're going to build a car factory right next to it. We're going to streamline the supply chain. I'm going to add a bunch of autonomy from the ground up. We don't have any legacy systems that we have to deal with. We're just going to build it from the beginning to be flexible, to be modular, to be software driven rather than legacy systems driven. And he did it. He actually beat all the numbers. I think we need to do the same thing in defense. We just announced this program 3 weeks ago at Anduril that we're calling Arsenal. We're literally in site selection right now. We're going to build a 5 million square foot manufacturing campus somewhere in the United States. And the idea would be that, if we really need Stinger missiles, we can produce those at high scale. If we really need next generation Roadrunner interceptors, we can pivot the entire line to build those. If you need to build fighter planes, you should be able to turn on a dime to build fighter planes. And I think it will be a very expensive and kind of longer term project, but somebody has to do this. Otherwise, we're in big trouble.
Michael, I want to ask you a related question here, which is, on the protect and promote framework that you flagged, you've been generally kind of an advocate for light touch, pro-industry regulatory approach, but also you and many other folks in the previous administration were very worried about Chinese supply chain infiltration, whether it's and you see it in basically everything, right? In drones or in cranes or in chips or whatever. How do you make sure that you're not sticking those parts into American manufacturing without creating a massive burden for American companies?
Yeah, it's tough. I think the first way you kind of start is you have to identify which are the most critical technologies that you want to try to protect and ensure that don't have vulnerabilities. When I was at the Pentagon, we launched this sort of program around U.S. manufactured drones to try to find a way to remove DJI from the DoD, and you sort of had these sort of like blue certified drones that have components that are cleared. And in the Biden administration, you're seeing some activity around cranes. So for these large ship-to-shore cranes, which exist at our largest port facilities, the majority of them in the world are created by this Chinese company called ZPMC, and a big chunk of them are actually sort of remote controlled from actually like offices in China where people are steering these, and to like think that some technology like that doesn't carry some sort of risk for a port is funny in of itself. In the U.S., we have these cranes, and it remains a little unclear kind of the risk profile associated with that technology. So that's one that actually is being taken on. So I think that's kind of, I think, one thing we need to think very carefully about, of understanding that. And I think it comes to sort of like, where do you draw the line on what are the most sort of critical or most sensitive technologies for the U.S. to function.
Did you encounter challenges with prioritization on that? Because I mean, that's been a criticism from folks in this room, I think, of recent industrial policies, that if you prioritize everything, you're not prioritizing anything. What does it look like in practice to say we're focusing on drones and cranes, say that's our priority? Yeah,
it's hard, and I think where you draw the line again is challenging. I think there are some obvious ones that have started in the Trump administration, continued into the Biden administration. I think the most obvious one is high-end, state-of-the-art semiconductors, and whether or not we need to be able to control their export to China. If you have this sort of fundamental belief that the success of their development of AI that could be used for military purposes is contingent on their ability to access these high-end chips, it makes a lot of sense to try to restrict those. Being able to do that in a timely fashion in a technology that is constantly being updated is very hard in and of itself. So an agency within Commerce called BIS, which is responsible for putting out these export controls, tasking them with being on the ball and like keeping up with the latest can be a little challenging. I think the other thing that we tend to see a lot is it tends to be a bit of a leaky process itself. So you could put an export control on some of these chips, but actually being able to enforce them and make sure that the chips they're making their way into China from other means is also very hard. There are other backdoors which are interesting. I actually saw this FT piece a little while ago, was kind of discussing iFly Tech, which is a Chinese AI company that specializes in voice recognition, and it's used and has been used for a lot of these Uyghur-related issues. They essentially found a way to access A100s through a U.S. cloud provider, and were able to run their training on that. And that shows that even though they weren't able to like buy the A100s themselves, they were able to access these clusters to train their models. So this is the kind of stuff that you have to consistently play whack-a-mole.
Trae, any follow-ups there from the manufacturing side?
Yeah, I think the key kind of piece to this is talent. Countries like our adversaries, Russia, China, they have civil-military fusion, essentially mandatory conscription of the most talented people in their society towards the biggest problems that they face. You could say the same thing with Israel. Obviously, mandatory conscription there makes a huge difference culturally for the country. In the United States, we don't have this, and I don't think that's bad. I like democracy, and I like that we have freedom. But our elite class has basically decided that they don't want to work on any of the problems that matter. They want to make monkey JPEGs. And that's really annoying. And I think this is why it's so important that people like Michael left the tech industry to go work in civil service and take a huge pay cut, show up to the office every day and deal with a bunch of knuckle draggers and actually move the needle for the country. So really grateful for your work and what that really meant to everyone in the tech community. But I think there's something to this idea that it's kind of a cop out to say you have to focus on a limited set of things. I think the answer is no. We should have a country that actually works, and we should have talented people working in government that have accountability for making sure that our government works. And right now it doesn't, and that's actually largely like your guys' fault because you don't work in the government. Maybe you should.
Well, let me put this question to both of you. In the event of a second Trump administration, do you expect to see more tech talent headed to DC than the last time around?
I mean, Michael is going to have an opinion on this as well. I think it's two-part. Like the government has to ask them to come and help, and then they have to be willing to come and help. And in the last administration, I think the latter was a bigger problem. There was less of a willingness to go into it. The question is like, is there going to be a match between those two sides of the equation? The Biden administration, I think it kind of showed us that it was a problem in the other direction. It was that there's one member of the cabinet that has private sector experience, Gina Rometty. That's it. One person. The whole politically appointed class they're political careerists. They're or academics, think tank employees. And this is not actually going to help. It's just like you're going right back to the swamp. And so I think we need to see in this next administration a willingness to say, hey, if we want Elon Musk to come and run a committee, like we're gonna find out a way to get him to do it. I think that's a huge sign in the right direction. But I would hope that there will be people that maybe aren't politically minded necessarily that are going to be willing to step into these roles where they can really make a difference.
Yeah, I think I'm optimistic. I think this the second go around, I think there'll be a lot more willingness to come help. I think the way the country has changed over the last few years, I think has made it clear to people that the government isn't working and isn't solving the problems it needs to for the American people. So I think on that side, I think there will be a demand. I think also what will be exciting is that the pathways to be able to go into these important roles, I think, are like much better understood by I think the folks that will be around this next go round than they were previously. So there are it's critical to get the cabinet right. It's critical to get the deputy secretary right and the undersecretary right. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of a lot of this sort of tech policy work is done at levels below that, and understanding how to get very talented people slotted into those positions where they can help drive these policies forward in an environment where tech and science broadly is always going to be sort of a tier 2 issue, and you have to be politically savvy in order to figure out how to get it to a tier 1 and ultimately execute.
I'd love to hear from you, Michael, and maybe you, Trae, if you have thoughts on this, on for our audience of technically savvy people who are maybe not all in DC, like say a little bit more about those pathways or how they should be thinking about ways they can contribute.
Yeah, I think that for each individual agency, there are pockets that focus very much on the important technology issues. Some are more obvious than others, but I think I don't have a list of roles in front of me, but I think it's safe to say that if you do want to work in technology, there are lots and lots of places, and certainly would love to follow up with anyone who wants to. But I think within each agency and their general mandate, there is some tech and science policy that's done, and the role of the White House is to sort of coordinate those individuals across those agencies to drive a plan forward. So if the White House was really concerned about the access of China to high-end semiconductors, there'll be an interagency process where you need experts that know about semiconductors to help write export control rules. Those people will be sitting at BIS, that is part of the Commerce Department. There'll be equities from the Department of Defense that cares about sort of how these, which particular semiconductors, what could be used for, which weapon system's going to go in, that kind of thing, and so on. And all these people have to surround a table and solve that one semiconductor problem. So I think there's ample opportunity, and there is a really big need for smart people.
Michael, you were in the kind of in the White House science and technology apparatus in the White House. Each administration kind of structures things differently. The managerial structure looks different, administration to administration. I'd love to hear, yeah, I guess your lessons from how it was structured in your time and what you think worked in terms of managing that broad kind of full spectrum, full federal government approach to science and tech.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two. I guess there's two broad categories of technology policy. There's what I call national technology policy and federal technology policy. And in the federal category, what I typically bucket there is like how the government can use technology to better do the work that it needs to in order to serve citizens. And that type of work is generally coordinated and led by the federal CIO that sits within the Office of Management and Budget in the White House. And those are decisions that individual agencies need to make around sort of like moving to the cloud, what software should they be buying, that kind of thing. And that's one category of work that is most often extraordinarily nonpartisan and just needs smart technologists to help the government just do a better job operating as a government. And those are critical. Then there's the second half, which is national tech policy. And that's the kind of work around how can you, or what policies do you need to put in place. Sort of in our admin, the core North Star was to ensure American leadership in emerging tech. So if you as a government decide that we need to be leaders in artificial intelligence, what policies are in place to do that? How do you coordinate research and development across the agencies so the dollars that they're spending sort of align with the priorities of the president? What do you do on the regulatory front? A lot of conversations earlier today about, export controlling of large language models or not? Do you sort of export control individual chips or not? What kind of regulations do individual agencies need to have on AI use cases and so on? So that's the kind of work that's done on the national tech front. And at its most sort of elementary sense, the White House serves as a convening and coordination function. So, and almost what's unique about tech policy is that it has equities across a number of agencies. So take like commercial drone operations. Lots of people want to have drone deliveries to their house. And you think, oh, maybe we just need the FAA to approve that. But in reality, there's so many other equities there. The Department of Energy doesn't want drones flying around any of their sites. The DHS is concerned about the use of drones in particular events that happen in the U.S. or for other safety reasons. DoD obviously has equities. So you have to get all these people around the table and get them all to agree to a path forward. And that's typically kind of the role of the White House to do.
Trae, I want to go back to something you said right at the beginning that government folks in government are generally want to do the right thing, working on the right things. The National Defense Authorization Act passes every year with supermajorities. And it's an opportunity each year to change how we procure defense tech, all kinds of opportunities. Why doesn't that opportunity get taken more aggressively to do the kinds of things that you like to see happen?
I think there's always policy changes that make it into the NDAA that benefit the tech industry, or at least intended to benefit the tech industry. It's definitely like something that the committees are thinking about as they pull this stuff together. And I could reference all sorts of stuff that's happened over the last 7 years since we started Anduril that were moments of celebration about things that happened in the NDAA. And so I think it's less that it's not an opportunity that's frequently taken. It's that I'm not sure policy is the thing that is really the driver. I think it's much more culture. And you can have moderately intelligent people. I'm not going to say super intelligent, but moderately intelligent people who are really well-intentioned, who are patriots, who love the country, that don't have the level of expertise to actually make some of these really complicated decisions. And that's not a critique of them. Like I generally speaking, like respect government employees and think that they're doing a great service to the country. But the world is way more complicated today than it was in the 18th century. You could make the argument that the founding fathers had read literally every important piece of literature that had ever been written in human history. That was like actually sort of believable at that time. In 2024, two professors in the same department at a university probably haven't even read each other's research. It's just infinitely more complicated. And we're asking people with no tech background to make really difficult decisions about core platforms that are going to change the face of the world over 10 years. And they're not able to do that effectively. And this is both a fault of the government for letting the culture and the aspirational nature of civil service deteriorate over time. But it's also the responsibility of the tech industry to step up and be willing to fill some of these roles, as Michael said, because it is really important to the future of the country and I think therefore the world.
you were reflecting on lessons from Ukraine a little earlier. I feel like my folk understanding of military lessons from Ukraine is you need a ton of cheap drones, like way more cheap drones. I know that's something that you guys have talked about. What's the like one cut beyond that? Like obviously we need way more autonomous, cheap systems. Flesh that view out for us a little more.
Well, one of the things that a lot of people in the media pointed out very quickly in the war in Ukraine is that the Ukrainians were using a bunch of Chinese equipment. And that's true. They were using a bunch of Chinese equipment. The reason they were doing that is that we were offering them expensive, exquisite systems that if they were defeated using electronic warfare methods like GPS denial or something like that, you're crashing a multi-million-dollar vehicle. And they're just not going to be willing to do that at scale. And so what did they do instead? They bought $1,000 Chinese drones and sent them up, and they were attritable. It's like, if it's lost, who cares? I've got another 1,000 of them in a shipping container, and they cost me nothing. And so it was never about like China having superior military technology necessarily. It was really that we just weren't playing the same cost arbitrage. This applies to really high-end systems that are critical for conflict with great powers like Patriot missiles. So the United States pays a little over $2.25 million every time we fire a Patriot missile. Our partner nations pay about $4 million every time they fire a Patriot missile. And they usually shoot 2 if you're actually trying to take down a target, because you can't afford to miss and have something make it through your defensive barrier. The Iranian Shahed drone cost $180,000. So every time we shoot $8 million of Patriot missiles at a $180,000 drone, we are losing, whether or not you destroy that asset. And I think this is what Iran realized when they launched all of those drones against Israel. It wasn't like, we think all these are going to get through and we're going to deal a bunch of, kinetic damage to the Israeli citizens. It was, we're going to shoot a pile of heaping garbage that cost us $20 million, and you're going to counter it with $1 billion effort. And you can only do that so many times before the economic impact becomes really damning. And so I think the approach that we're taking at Anduril is, how do we get low-cost attritable systems onto the battlefield as quickly as possible in a way that is scalable and manufacturable? And I think that is the future of warfare. This is what our adversaries are doing. This is where they're investing their dollars, and it's where we need to be investing our dollars as well.
Maybe this is a dumb question, but we had like 20 years of counterinsurgency wars. It's not like we just come out of a great power conflict and we're building battleships for that great power conflict. Is it that we have the wrong paradigm previously? Like, why is it like a lesson from Ukraine and Middle East conflict now that's so striking? Why wasn't this a lesson 15 years ago? Or was it? And I have my timeline wrong.
Well, as Kratsios mentioned, this is really all about deterrence. Like, obviously we want to be able to win conflicts quickly if we find ourselves in a conflict. But more importantly, we would love to have enough of an advantage that conflict was unthinkable, because the adversary knew going in that they were going to get their clock cleaned. And this worked for a long time during the Cold War. Like, it was believable. There was this credible threat of nuclear weapons that, our adversaries believed, if we really do something crazy, the United States will literally nuke us off the face of the earth. No one believes this anymore. And this is why you see all these conventional wars happening, because I don't think there's a single person, in, Iran that's thinking like, well, if we launch another salvo at the United States, they're going to nuke Tehran. We're not going to nuke Tehran. Like, that's crazy. And so I think you have to develop new methods of deterrence in order to conduct this next generation of warfare. And so it's just kind of the shifting sands of technology are leading us down into new paradigms. And we're still, in many ways, stuck in this, like, we're going to spend $15 billion on an aircraft carrier. We're going to spend $180 million on a fighter plane. And that paradigm has passed us. It just doesn't really matter anymore. But that's where the majority of the dollars are still flowing.
We're running out of time, so one quick question for each of you. Michael, you've pushed, I think successfully in some ways, for deeper science and tech ties with Europeans based on kind of shared values, but they hate innovation. So how do you do that?
I think the U.S. should just keep showing the way of how to continue to be a leader in tech and hope for the best with them. But I think the reality is, like, they are our allies and our friends, and we should keep letting them know how to do it right, and we can just hope and pray.
The funniest thing to me about the European innovation thing is, it's like, imagine you're playing a game of soccer and they like get a steal right inside the penalty box, and they turn around and they just slam a kick right into their own goal, and they're like, "Yeah!" You're like, "Dude, you just scored on your own goal. That you're not supposed to do that. You know that you want growth, right?" They don't seem to understand. Lots of own goals.
Well, Trae, last question, and this is totally for my personal interest. Why do people in defense always say warfighter and not warrior? Like the word already exists. Why is it the American warfighter?
Well, in the World War I, World War II era, everyone was a warrior. Like they were infantry. Everybody has a gun. They're out on the battlefield. They're fighting the war. And it oftentimes gets forgotten that like the Air Force didn't exist. It was the Army Air Corps. They were all Army people. The CIA didn't exist. It was also part of the core defense apparatus. And so everyone was a warrior because they were all going into battle. That's not modern warfare at all. There's intelligence, MOS, there's people doing maintenance, there's people doing supply, logistics. And so they're war fighters. They're people that are participating in the war effort, but not everybody is a grunt.
That completely answers my question. Thank you. Please join me in giving up a warm round of applause for Michael and Trae.